Hi, I'm Jennie Dugan. I'm here today to tell you about a different kind of approach to a real-life spiritual path. I'm going to tell you first, I'm no scholar, I'm not a Bible expert. I came by this knowledge by virtue of my own experience. I'm an everyday person with an everyday life. Let me tell you about some of the people in my everyday life. The other day I had a phone call from a 5-year-old who said, "Grandma, will you buy me an umbrella?" And I said, "Well, sure, but what do you need an umbrella for?" And she said, "So I don't get wet." And then she paused and she said, "So I don't get wet if it's raining outside and I want to play with the new ball that you bought me." We're going to come back to that in a minute when I show you how she intuitively did what Jesus also did. But a few weeks before that, I was on Facebook, and my very gentle friend that I don't see often had an outburst on Facebook, and she said, "Oh my gosh, Justin and Katie really messed up." And then she put in the chilling line, "The police are on the way to Indiana to get them." Justin and Katie, my very gentle friends' friends, had robbed a bank. I don't think they started their life thinking, this is where I want to end up. And I think that most people watching this right now probably have never robbed a bank. But what about this? Years ago, a friend of mine said to me that she thought I was controlling, and I was stunned. I said, "It's my life, why shouldn't I be in control?" But was I in control? I had a steady income, but my money problems were endless. I was surrounded by people, yet constantly having relationship problems. To me, daily life just meant new problems. When I found what I now think of as the Jesus climate, my entire life changed. I'm going to take what I learned over a period of about 10 years, pieces I put together, and I'm going to condense it into 10 minutes. It's something I've come to think of as the Jesus climate. Did you ever feel like you could walk into a room and just feel the climate in the room? A pastor told a story of how he went to another church to give a sermon. He said it felt like he was walking into a refrigerator. Nobody looked at him, nobody smiled, no one greeted him. When he stood up in front and gave his talk, no one reacted. It was as if they didn't hear him. And he called the whole climate cold. Did you ever walk into a room and it felt warm, it felt inviting, it felt open, trusting, or just the opposite? It felt fear-filled and mistrustful and edgy? That's a climate. One of the things I realized is a climate isn't just some vague thing that belongs to a group or a building or a room. Every person carries a climate. When I found these seeds, I realized I could shift my climate from the negative climate, the one I call the Pharisee climate, which I'll tell you about in a minute, to one I now call the Jesus climate, one that opens up the door to that spiritual path. We're going to focus on 6 very specific seeds that create a climate that grow fruit in your life instead of doing what we normally do, which is to focus on the fruit. Before we jump to the seeds, I want to take a moment to look at this ladder and ask yourself where you feel you are right now. I can tell you, before I found the seeds, I was in the chaos at the bottom. And if you feel like you're different at home than you are at work, if you're different on the inside than what the world sees, that's okay. Make a note of that. At the bottom is chaos, and shortly up from the chaos is a place where we try to put rigid rules and structure around it just so we can feel some sense of power, some sense of control in our lives. But we start to see cycles of punishment and reward in there. We start to feel guilt and revenge and paybacks, and that actually keeps us back from God. If we can move beyond that, we get to a place where we want to understand and also be understood, where we want to show caring and feel caring. But within that, we can also find a sense of wanting to protect, and that can create a system of rewards and punishment, which can create a don't care attitude. It's beyond that when we get to a point of true communion with God, where spontaneously bursting creativity becomes normal in our lives. So look at the ladder and don't try to reach for what's on the ladder, but just ask yourself, where do you feel you are right now in your life? All right, let's jump into the seeds. When I was very controlling, it was actually an attempt to bring some order to the chaos. The single thing that broke the back of control was not an attempt to be in control, as I thought I was doing, nor was it just giving control to everybody else. What reverses control is called focus on problems. It's taking one problem at a time, and it's not worrying about who to blame or where it came from. It's this problem. Jesus said, "What can I do for you? How can I help you?" And he said it more than once. What's the problem right here, right now? This is what happens when you focus on a problem. When I looked at my money and I said, what's my problem right here, right now, today? Not in my whole life, today. My problem is I have this many needs and this much money. And when I focused on that one problem, I was liberated. For the first time in my life, I felt in control. It made me realize just the power of equality, that God really does see all of us the same. God gives us the same kind of problems and gives us the same ability to solve those problems. That's part of the Jesus climate, that feeling of equality. The opposite that we see in the Pharisee climate is inequality. And with inequality, there's a fear that we're not good enough, and there's also a fear that causes us to try to prove that we're superior. Here's the thing about equality. If we're going to look to the world to find equality, we're probably always going to be disappointed. Years ago, after I found these seeds, I had applied for a position, and I asked a doctor if he would put in a good word for me, and he said no. He said, I can't, because there are two of you that are applying that I've worked with, and you are her equal. And I paused, and he said, and she is your equal. And from that moment on, I took that to heart. Anytime I don't feel equal in any way, whether I feel they're not coming up to standard or I feel inferior, I say, I am her equal, she is my equal, we are equals. And it levels the playing field. Surprisingly, it opened the door to something I thought I was good at but wasn't. That's the third seed. And the third seed in the Jesus climate is completely caring. But what people see in the Pharisee climate, in the climate where we're fear-filled and we're mistrustful, is a don't care attitude. When I was accused of being controlling, what people felt from me was that I didn't care, that all I cared about was power and control. Nothing could have been further from the truth. But when I moved to the Jesus climate and began to care and allow myself to show caring, regardless of how people treated me, regardless of how I feared they would treat me in the future, if I simply opened myself up to be caring, I found myself moving more into that spiritual path, and yet it felt more solid than ever before in my life. The fourth seed in the Pharisee climate is strategy and manipulation. Now, most of us would say we're not manipulative people, and yet we have a life strategy. We know what we want, we know the fruit we're after, and without ever realizing it, we're trying to manipulate life and prayer and even the people around us to get what we want. I would have told you before I found these seeds, even early when I had these seeds, that I was open to wherever God led me. But the difference is on a daily basis, if we're open to that still small voice of God and doing what God wants us to on a daily basis, that's what creates the Jesus climate and plants the seeds that creates the fruit that we want in our lives. When my granddaughter told me that she wanted an umbrella and paused to describe exactly why she wanted it, she was doing something that Jesus did all the time. When Jesus was questioned about whether he was the Messiah, he said, go and tell them what you've seen. The lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see. He described things. He didn't tell us to describe things, but he did describe things. And he did tell us not to do the opposite that we see in a Pharisee climate, which is to be quick to judge. The opposite of describing is being judgmental, but not just judging. It's that urge to have snap evaluations and snap judgments and have an opinion on everything. And the way that we can break that back is to simply describe. I had a friend who had gotten a new car, and someone else said, oh, she got that same old red everyone has. But we could have described it. We could have said she got a new car, she drove it to work today, and it was red. That's the difference. And the difference is whether you want a negative climate that's closed off or the open climate of the Jesus climate. The last seed is perhaps one of the most common, and it may be one of the easiest to reverse. It's the rigid rules of the Pharisee climate. When we're trying to climb out of the chaos, when we're trying to control our situation, and when we're living with fear and mistrust, we create rigid rules. We box things in instead of opening ourselves up to God, what God wants. But the opposite, the way to stop having those rigid rules, isn't simply to dispose of the rules, to have no rules. The opposite is to do what Jesus did, and that's to have a what-if attitude. And Jesus had a what-if attitude. He knew his principles. He knew what God wanted from him. He knew his purpose in life, but he had a what-if attitude in the everyday. When he counseled his disciples, he said, when you go to a town, if they do this, then you do this. If they do that, then you do that. If they welcome you, then you stay with them. If they don't welcome you, you shake it off and move on. Jesus lived a what-if attitude in the everyday, and it is one of the most liberating seeds of the Jesus climate. When I began planting these seeds in my life, all I knew was that I wanted to stop feeling the seeds of the Pharisee climate. What I found was that when I began to plant these seeds in my life, I began to see a real life, solid, but spiritual path for the first time in my life. For the first time, I really began to hear that still small voice of God in the everyday. I felt sheltered, I felt protected more than I ever had in my life. And that's my wish for you, that if you plant the seeds on the Jesus climate, that you too will begin to feel that real life spiritual path that yields better fruit in your life than you ever could have imagined. My name is Jennie Dugan, and you can learn more about the Jesus climate at jenniedugan.com. Thank you.